Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. On Monday, the ACC fined NC State and UNC Chapel Hill for a post-game fight that started when NC State planted a flag on the Tar Heels midfield. The ACC said in a statement, the unsportsmanlike behavior that was displayed is unacceptable and tarnishes the passionate on-field play between these institutions. WRAL investigative sports reporter Brian Murphy is here to break down what we saw on what turned into a pretty vicious rivalry weekend.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was crazy. There were fights all over the country, post-game brawls, some on-field brawls too, and in a couple of the games, some punches thrown. I saw in the Notre Dame USC game, the BYU Houston game, but I mean the big fight, at the Ohio State Michigan game, which required the use of pepper spray to disperse. By those terms, the NC State UNC fight was mild, was
right.
tame.
Yeah, and so you mentioned some of the teams there. What were some other places that we saw these fights, and what played out between NC State and this UNC situation?
Yeah, so, the weekend was rivalry weekend, and so we got a lot of in-state games or border state games that, tend to bring out a lot of emotions. And for some reason, the visiting team won a lot of these games. And so it's not really a new concept, but this concept of planting your flag at midfield when you go on the road and beat your rival, has sort of gained in prominence over the last decade or so. Baker Mayfield, often credited with being the first one to do it. NC State did it a couple years ago at Carolina, and this year Carolina, I think, was ready for it. And many of their players rushed out to sort of defend the logo after NC State won. Dramatic win. They won with 25 seconds left. They scored the game-winning touchdown. The game was back and forth the whole second half, so it wasn't really a blowout. So, both teams were still very emotional by the end of the game. And NC State tried to plant the flag. Carolina tried to pick up the flag and throw it away. There was pushing. There was shoving. And that's sort of where it ended. I mean, it didn't spill out into the stands as we've seen in some other, incidents. It didn't really get too violent, requiring the use of police and pepper spray or whatever, got used at Michigan, Ohio State. And then, Carolina players stood on the logo while NC State kind of celebrated with their own fans in the corner, waving the flag, doing flips and somersaults and things like that in the end zone. Kind of what you expect after a big rivalry game.
Yeah, I mean, tensions are always high during that weekend. What has been the punishment, though, in these situations? Because, fighting on the field, certainly the situation you mentioned where pepper spray was used, I mean, that's a little bit beyond the scope.
Yeah, so the ACC fined and publicly reprimanded both NC State and UNC. Also, Virginia and Virginia Tech, who had a little fracas after their game as well. We saw recently that North Carolina Central and Howard had a post-game brawl, and that resulted in suspensions. Almost over 3 dozen players from those two teams were suspended for one game. The ACC has not issued any suspensions. And of course, that would be for a bowl game. The season is pretty much over for both teams. They'll both play in bowl games, of course. Michigan, Ohio State, maybe you could see some suspensions. That would be very detrimental to Ohio State. Their next game is likely to be in the college football playoff. This is up to the conferences. The NCAA doesn't really deal with this. There's no commissioner of college football. If this were to happen in the NFL, for example, Roger Goodell, the commissioner, the Players Association, would have some negotiation. There would be a suspension handed down, likely an appeal. College football has 10 different conferences or 9 different conferences at this point, sort of policing its own. And so the ACC said no suspensions. They're not going to comment further on the situation, and it's over. So it's interesting. There has been harsher discipline for incidents like this than NC State and UNC had. Right,
and I wonder, is there any chance that the programs themselves might self-police here a little bit?
Yeah, this is a very passionate rivalry, and Dave Doran at NC State has talked about how important this game is, and so there's always going to be that emotion. I imagine if UNC were able to win next year in Raleigh, they would try to plant a flag. I think some of this comes down to this flag planting thing. Like I said, it's sort of risen in prominence over the last decade, and you wonder if someone, be it the conference or the NCAA or somebody, will say, hey, look, celebrate all you want, but you can't be sticking things in the field At Arizona State, they put their sphere, their trident, in the midfield logo. We've seen other things get planted. That seems to be what really does elevate these situations from just jawing back and forth to something physical is when that thing gets planted at midfield. And so I wonder if the NCAA or the conferences get together and say, look, no more planting stuff. No more, doing something demonstrative on the logo when you win one of these games. Other than that, I mean, I think for as long as football's been played, we've had these kind of jawing back and forth, pushing and shoving. For some reason, football players like to hit each other with punches, even though they're wearing helmets and more likely to injure their hand than the person they're fighting against. But I mean, some of it you can't really get out of the game. But I do think they may look at, this intentionally planting something that sort of becomes the focal point of a lot of these post-game brawls.
Okay, let's take a quick break right there, and we'll be right back. Brian, you mentioned that this phenomenon of flag planting seems to be something that riles teams up when their rivals do it on their home fields, but how have fans reacted to all of these different fights that we saw over the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot on social media, it sort of comes down into two camps, right? One, hey, boys will be boys. I love the passion. That's great. And if it happens to us, so be it. It's worth it. And then the other reaction has been, hey, why are we doing this? Is silly. Like, why are we marring these great games, which everyone cares a lot about, with these fights at the end of games? Somebody could get seriously hurt or worse. Somebody could get injured or suspended and miss an important game. So why are we doing this? So I sort of, you can see it in kind of both. You can see both sides of this, both perspectives. I think I come down a little more on the why are we doing this side. You just won, go celebrate with your friends, celebrate with your family, celebrate with your fellow students. But do you need to start something at the middle of the field? That being said, this is what makes college football, right? There's intense passion. You often live right next to somebody who's cheering for the other team.
Right.
And so this is what drives the passion of the sport. And so I think you don't want to get rid of that, especially at a time where, fans are more important than ever.
Right. And I guess, how has this shifted over the years? I mean, at this point, football in America, in some places, especially college football, goes back 100 years or more. So have we seen sort of, a trend like this in the past where, right now it seems like, okay, this flag planting thing is really picking up steam, and then we're kind of figuring out where it's going to go from here. But have we seen things like that in the past that have been dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, we saw the horns down thing, right?
Right.
There had to be a rule about what players could do when they played against Texas, putting the horns down. Dating myself a little bit, but if you think about those great Miami teams in the early 90s, I mean, they build the game against Notre Dame as Catholics versus convicts. And the Miami team had this swagger and got into brawls all over the place during games and after games, and maybe even before games. They showed up for a game against Penn State wearing their fatigues. So, I mean, all of this stuff has sort of changed, right? It hasn't always been about planting the flag, but we've seen these turnover chains. The teams have always found a way to celebrate or to create this us versus them mentality. I don't, probably dating way back to when the first college football game was played and throughout the decades, we get used to seeing things like Army-Navy, right? Which after the game, they're very respectful to each other. They go and usually sing the alma mater with both service academies. And so, that's everyone's idyllic version of what this looks like. You lay it all on the line on the field. When it's over, and you stand arm in arm. Quite frankly, it hasn't been like that for many decades in college athletics.
Yeah, and I think about, we were talking before we started recording. I went to Georgia, the Georgia Tech rivalry. Of course, that was a crazy game for a totally different set of circumstances and actually was pretty cordial considering. But I can remember one time when I was a student, Tech beat us at home, and we have, Between the Hedges is the big thing at the University of Georgia, and they were ripping up our hedges, and we were all really mad about that. So there is just these little things like that also just exist within these individual rivalries. Heading into the playoff game season, bowl games, all of that, do you think we need to worry about seeing more of this, or maybe because these were like those very intense specific rivalries, maybe that was just a right now thing?
Yeah, I think it's a rivalry weekend type of thing. I don't think you'll see somebody win a playoff game and get into a fight. I mean, there's just too much on the line at this point. But that rivalry thing is like a 365-day. You talked about Georgia Tech, NC State, North Carolina, Auburn, Alabama, Florida State. They had a little problem after their game. Virginia Tech. These are people who, you live this rivalry every day. And so it just has a little more meaning than as important as these college football playoff games will be, or these bowl games. You don't see the kind of passion after the game or the vitriol toward your opponent the same way you do during rivalry week. I mean, the interesting thing is, I don't know what would happen if Carolina had won that game, come back and won, but they may have stormed the field and torn down the goalposts. So, this is kind of part of college football. If you're the home team and you win, you often do damage to your own field.
Right.
And if the visitor wins, they try to plant something at midfield and do damage that way. So, coming onto the field is sort of this part of college athletics.
Yeah, and I feel like that's also become more common. I mean, it happened recently to Georgia when we lost to them at Ole Miss. So, I feel like I've seen it a few times this season.
Yeah, I mean, Vanderbilt won and put their goalposts in the river. So, and you want to – it's interesting because we saw this with Duke and these court storms. They often happen to Duke basketball. When they lose, they're often highly ranked, and the fans from the opposing teams storm the court. We saw an incident with Kyle Filipowski last year, I think at Wake Forest, where he ran into somebody or somebody ran into him. And so you really worry about player safety in these things. Football obviously is a little detached, but we've seen fans storm the field during football games as well. And you worry about a player, retaliating and hurting someone, or vice versa, a player getting caught and stuck with a bunch of students, often who've had too much to drink.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's a safety aspect that you worry about as well. It's slightly different than the two teams fighting each other. But college sports would like to get this under control. You don't see this at the NFL. You don't see this in Major League Baseball. Nobody's storming the field after a big win or a big upset.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's definitely you want the passion, but we want to be safe too.
Right.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.